Sorry.
The dog's barking and everybody's talking upstairs and the Alexa's going
Come on,
off.
people, we're doing live streams here. All right. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Lynn. How you doing?
I'm good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Forum Friday. And on Forum Fridays, Mark and I reach out to the forum and see what's going on there. What's going on at the forums, Mark?
Well, it's been a little bit quiet in the forum again, but we have one conversation that's been of interest is with our friend Goodwin from Mali. And he uses the handle Delicious Bread. And he's on an adventure to, he's innovating the bread world in West Africa is what he's doing. I mean, so he's on the forefront of things. He's recognized that there's a lot of bland bread in West Africa, and he wants to differentiate himself in doing something different and doing things that are more interesting. So he's diving into the sponge and dough process to get more fermented notes and flavors, and was kind of like asking, and quite rightly so, when you're new to that process, is like, well, how do I calculate my water absorption? Do I include what's on the sponge, or is that all separate, right? Do I put my yeast in the sponge, or does it go in some of it in the dough, and all these kinds of things? And so there's some of the processes are individual selection, but generally speaking, the water is, you look at your absorption for the sponge first of all. Like if you start with 10 kilos of flour, and then you're going to use probably 50 or 55% water for your sponge. Now, that 55% water might only be 11% of the total flour, when you're using 50 kilos of flour in total, because you might use 10 kilos for the sponge and then 40 kilos for your dough. Some people go 50-50. There's various different ratios. It all depends on how much of that fermented flavor you want in your dough. And also it depends on how much room you have in terms of your sponge rooms and stuff to be able to start all these pre-ferments. Because if you're doing batch process and you have to have, a different batch going every hour, well, then, you're going to back up pretty quick if you do 20 kilo sponges all the time, right? Mm-hmm. So you kind of have to balance between that. In my experience, most commercial bakers put all of the yeast in the sponge. And then they're at the dough side, they're just adding flour, water, and all of the other ingredients. Some producers add all or some of the fat to the sponge, and or yeast food, but generally not things like ascorbic, things like ascorbic acids or flavors or other emulsifiers or dough conditioners. They're usually all added on the dough side, right? So it's in baker's parlance, it's sponge side and dough side. It's not really a side per se, but it's the way bakers like to talk, right? Just like bakers confuses the heck out of people, and really it's just a ratio, which is everything in ratio to the flour, right?
I actually have seen the yeast put on the dough side. Yes. And I don't know why they do that, but maybe because the sponge is too hot, or maybe the sponge is lost its gas. I don't know, but
it
don't
gets
you
gassy,
think
or they're getting too much fermented notes, too yeasty or too fast, because the whole purpose of the sponge also is to allow the yeast to, in a sense, duplicate, right? So you're getting, you can use less yeast and get more power out of it and have a less yeasty flavor and more of a fermented bread beer aroma. Like there's flavor companies that sell, like I know of one, Butter Buds. They actually sell a beer aroma extracted through butter. And it's basically really, although they call it a beer aroma, it really is used mostly in breads to provide that nice bready fermented aroma that people like in fresh bread, right?
That's true.
And I've seen people put half the yeast on the dough side as well, and it's just some people they feel like it's a precaution, or maybe it's like
I think it's like, it's like handicap, right? You're so afraid to go there. Like, take away the Band-Aid.
And instant yeast is used more and more today, until you get up to really big batches where it's just not as convenient to use instant yeast. It's impractical. Where in the larger systems, it's a creamed yeast system where it's pumped in liquid, and you take that liquid into account in your dough calculations and things like that. But generally speaking, when you use instant yeast, it's 1/3 of what the fresh yeast amount would be. And if you're doing lab experiments, then you want to replace the water portion as well. Because generally it is instant yeast is, although it's also a slightly different strain, but in general terms, it's dehydrated yeast. So if you're replacing 30 grams of fresh yeast with 10 grams of instant, you should also add that additional 20 grams of water. Because in small batch experiments on the lab bench, it can make a difference, right? A lot of quality control bakeries, like in flour mills and things like that, they still use fresh yeast. That is just their standard. And that they always rotate fresh yeast, and it's a little more consistent than sometimes instant can be from brand to brand or things like that, right? Their active yeast is very different. Active yeast is usually only 40% of the yeast total. And that is also handled differently because the yeast is protected with a starch coating, and it has to be activated. So it needs to be dissolved in warm water and sugar first. So it's used primarily by people who are baking at home. It's not used very much commercially at all. It's used somewhat in restaurant kitchens and things like that, because the one advantage that active yeast has is that it has a long shelf life. Instant yeast, once you open the vacuum pack, you usually only have about 7 to 10 days. And then it starts to lose some of its gassing power, its fermentation power. So it's best to then keep it refrigerated. That can help extend it for maybe an extra week or so. That's sort of thing, right?
Yeah, that's great.
And other things that Goodwin is doing is he's adding different spices and herbs, and there I recommend you always start at 1%. Start it at 1% and see what it tastes like first. It's easy to back off, to go to 0.5% maybe on some herbs that are really powerful. And you can always, if it's something that's pretty mild like cinnamon, you can always go up. Cinnamon would be one of the ones I would be cautious about too. I wouldn't go much over 3 or 4%, because cinnamon today is primarily made from kasha, which is a tree bark. And it has an enzyme in it that reacts, inhibits fermentation, and it reacts with the gluten and makes the dough very bucky. So if you want to make hot crust buns for Easter with lots of cinnamon in it, put the cinnamon in the glaze or something, or make it into a hot crust cinnamon bun. But you can only put so much cinnamon into the dough, and it won't function properly. Right?
Thanks, Mark. So what's happening next week?
Next week, we have a really cool seminar coming up, and it's all about selecting optimal flowers for your processes, for the products that you're making, and the types of processes that you're using. And that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah,
it's always
present again.
Yeah, and it's always a key thing is that, you know, not all flowers are created equal, as they say, right? So, you know, in different countries have also different milling processes and things like that. Just between the United States and Canada, flowers are very different, not only because of crop sourcing, as far as, you know, the way the flour is, or the wheat is grown in Canada, and the type of you know, nutrients it gets from the soil and things like that, but also just the way the mills are set up and the way they run, even within Canada, the mills often in Eastern Canada, like in Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia, they tend to be what we refer to in milling as a short run mill. They don't have as much starch damage on them. And for whatever reason, many generations ago, when the mills that were built out in Western Canada, they tend to be longer run mills, where they go through several more roll breaks than the ones in the East, and they have higher starch damage. And so then it changes the absorption on the flour, and it changes some of the dough functionality as well. That's so it's really key then to work with your supplier and understand the instrumentation that you have available to you and stuff. So it's going to be a really informative seminar. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Mark. Thanks for joining me on this week's Forum Friday.
My pleasure always. Have a fantastic weekend, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.